Thank you for staying after lunch. And so I wanted to let you know if I say anything wrong, Pastor John will fix it after I leave. And I did want to mention that I've got several books on the table. One is called Miraculous, Milestones in Science, Medicine, and Innovation, and it goes through how Christians invented hospitals. Right? It wasn't Islam that invented hospitals. It wasn't Hinduism. It wasn't Buddhism. But Christians. Jesus says, "I was sick and you visited me," and the Good Samaritan story. And so they would take pilgrimage to the Holy Land and wind up tired. And so every place where they were making a pilgrimage to, the decision was made to have a infirmary to convalesce. And they called it, the Latin word for traveler is hosp. That's where you get the word hospitality and hospital. Right? And anyway, it goes through all this history and all the leaders of the scientific revolution, Kepler, Copernicus, Galileo, they all believed in a creator. And so that's a great book. Well, I'm going to get into a book that called Who is the King in America? And it is sort of an overview of world history. So as I mentioned earlier, I spent several years researching every civilization that's ever existed on the planet and found some interesting things. So one, there's only about 5,000 or 6,000 years of recorded human history. That's human beings writing down human records. So we're not talking about carbon dating or anything, we're just talking about, and so writing was invented around 3300 BC, Sumerian cuneiform on clay tablets in the Mesopotamian Valley. Originally started as an accounting method to keep track of everything the king owned in town. Have you ever tallied where you draw the lines 1, 2, 3, 4, and a line across for 5? Well, that was basically the beginning of how cuneiform started. Neil deGrasse Tyson, an astrophysicist, on his Cosmos TV series, stood in the desert. He says it was here around 5,000 years ago between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers that we learned how to write. And so Egyptian hieroglyphics were invented around 3000 BC. Chinese pictogram characters by the Yellow Emperor around 2600 BC on bamboo annal books, and India's Harappan civilization around 2600 BC. Franklin Roosevelt gave a quote. He said, 5,000 years of recorded history have proven that mankind has always believed in God in spite of the many abortive attempts to exile God. So he's using the number of 5,000. Richard Overy wrote the Times Complete History of the World. He said, no date appears before the start of human civilizations around 5,500 years ago in the beginning of a written or pictorial history. So you round it out, 6,000 years is not that long. It's only 60 people living 100 years each back to back. How many of you have met someone who's lived 100 years or close to it? Maybe a grandmother? We're talking 60 grandmothers, and you're all the way back to the beginning of recorded human civilization. Not that long ago. 60 people living 100 years each back to back. And but now that we have 6,000 years of records, let's read them. What do they show? They show it's been a 6,000-year quest to rule the world. And so one of the first records is Nimrod, Tower of Babel. And the story is that Nimrod wanted to build the tower so high that if God destroyed the world again with a flood, he could survive on top. And so Nimrod made everyone bake bricks in town and bring them, or if not, he'd kill them. So it had this defiant against God, oppressive over man. And the Bible story says that God came down and confused the languages and the people scattered. But it's almost like every generation since has tried to rebuild the Tower of Babel. And each time it comes around, it's a little bit worse because with military advancements, the king can kill more people. Have you ever seen the movie The Terminator with Arnold Schwarzenegger years ago? Anyway, I guess I'm dating myself. How many have seen that movie? All right, so, okay. There's a scene where they have this metal robot chasing them and they blow it up and everybody in the audience sighs relief. And then the blown up metal robot, all the little metal pieces turn into like silvery droplets, and then they sort of like begin to roll together like mercury, right? And they form a metal pool, and out of this pool, this hand of the Terminator starts climbing out again, and everybody in the audience is like, how do you stop this thing? It's like, how do you stop this desire to rebuild the Tower of Babel. God comes down and scatters it, but every generation since keeps trying to rebuild it. And each time it comes around, it's a little bit worse. So in geometry, there's something called the golden ratio, or phi, P-H-I, or the Fibonacci sequence. Right? It's a rate of geometric expansion. A number plus the previous number equals the next number. Then that number plus the previous number equals the next number. And that, right? And so you observe it in nature in a seashell, where it does a little circle, comes around with a little bit bigger circle, then a bigger circle. You also observe it in the way a tornado spins, or a hurricane, or a galaxy. And it gets applied to other areas of academia, like investments. And so if your investment's growing at a certain rate, your asset advisor might say, well, it might grow this rate and get to be a really good investment. And so I thought I would examine all the kingdoms of world history and see if they sort of grew along the same rate. And they sort of do. And so you have this Nimrod Tower of Babel, and then around 2500 BC, you have Gilgamesh, king of Uruk. And he is the first one to build a wall around a city. And the oldest story ever written in any language is the Epic of Gilgamesh, in the ancient Akkadian language. And the story is that he is going on a long, long journey to meet an old guy who survived the global flood. Calls it a global flood. And matter of fact, over 100 ancient civilizations have flood stories in their ancient past. Gee, maybe there was a flood. And then around 2250 BC, you have Sargon of Akkadian. He conquers a bunch of walled cities from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, considered the first empire. And then you have 2,000 years of Egyptian pharaohs, and you have 5,000 years of Chinese emperors, and around 700 BC, you have Assyria is the biggest empire on the planet. And they take the 10 northern tribes of Israel captive. Capital of Assyria was Nineveh. Remember Jonah the prophet? And then Assyria is conquered by Babylon, which is conquered by Persia. And so you have Cyrus of Persia. He's the one that lets the Jews go back and rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. But Persia was the biggest empire on the planet at that time, 127 provinces. But then Persia is conquered by Alexander the Great, and he has the biggest empire in the world, right? 330 BC. And he stopped from going into India. And India has Chandragupta and the Maurya Empire, and it controls a quarter of the world's population, even way back then. And then around 25 BC, you have Augustus Caesar, and he goes on to have the biggest empire that the planet had ever seen up to this point. Matter of fact, he wanted to have a worldwide tracking system called the census. If he could have used drones and 5G and cameras, he would have done that, right? He wanted to track everybody that he controlled. And then you have the Ascomite Empire in Africa, and then Attila the Hun, 450 AD. He has an army of 500,000 men, wiping out city after city across Europe. And then you have Justinian, the Byzantine Empire, and then Islam. And so in the 7th century, the Islamic Warriors conquer from the Persian Gulf to the Atlantic Ocean. They conquer Spain. And then they're stopped from going into France by Charles Martel and his grandson Charlemagne. And then Charlemagne, 800 AD, is crowned Holy Roman Emperor and controls Europe. And then you have the Vikings, 1000 AD, and they have these boats with low keels. They go up every river in Europe and conquer. And then you have 1200s. Genghis Khan conquers from Korea to Hungary, kills 30 million people, has the largest contiguous land-connected empire in world history. His grandson's Kublai Khan that runs China. And then you have Tamerlane in the 1300s. He controls all of Central Asia and kills another 17 million. And then Ivan the Terrible controls Russia. It's huge, 12 time zones, and he kills 60,000, and he kills his own son. And then you cross the ocean in the Aztecs with Montezuma controls Mexico, and Atahualpa in Inca Peru, and everybody in Peru was an employee of the state, right? Was a slave of the state. And then in the 1500s, the King of Spain has the biggest empire that planet Earth had ever seen. And the sun never set on the Spanish Empire. The Philippines are named after his son, King Philip of Spain. And then in the 1600s, France goes on to be the biggest empire. Louis the 14th, the Sun King of France, he actually controlled the land that we're on. And Then in the late throughout the 1800s, Britain was the largest empire that planet Earth had ever seen. Sun never set on the British Empire, 13 million square miles, 500 million people, India, Australia, New Zealand, Hong Kong, British Guyana, and all those countries. And so why does power keep wanting to concentrate? And again, the empires keep getting bigger because with military advancements and technological advancements, the king can kill more people. But it's that same fallen nature from the garden in Cain, kill, and Abel. And one king taking a kingdom from another king. And St. Augustine called it libido dominandi, the lust to dominate. And so you put some babies in a playpen, one will take the rattle from the others. You put some kids on a playground, one's the bully hogging the ball. You put some junior high girls in a clique, and one of them is the diva. You put some natives in the woods, one of them is an Indian chief. You put some people in an inner city, one of them is a gang leader. And all a king is a glorified gang leader. It's a hierarchical system. If you are friends with the king, you are more equal. If you are not friends with the king, you're less equal. And if you're an enemy of the king, you're dead or you're a slave. And people say, well, I thought slavery started in 1619. No, wherever you had the first king on top, you had slaves on the bottom. And the kings thought they were being nice by not killing you. And so this pyramid structure to society keeps repeating itself all around the world wherever you have humans. At this idea of this class structure of you're friends with the king on top, you're more equal. You're not friends, you're less equal. You're an enemy, you're a slave, or Now, what if you were the king? That'd be pretty neat. And then let's say you have a sister that you really love, and she gets married, has a kid. Now he's a teenager, and he's hanging around the wrong friends, drinking, partying, and he hits someone with the car and kills him. And now this teenager is facing manslaughter charges, mandatory prison time, and your sister comes begging to you. Says, you're the king. You're not going to let my little Johnny get locked away, are you? It wasn't his fault. Those other kids talked him into it, blah, blah, blah. What are you going to say to your sister? Well, I'll let little Johnny off the hook this time, but don't let it happen again. Guess what? As soon as you say that, you are the corrupt dictator. You just sent ripples through your kingdom that if somebody's family or friends with the king, they get special treatment. They're not family and friends, they don't get it. And if someone wants to point out your favoritism, you're going to be embarrassed and be tempted to want to shut them up. So it just happens. Power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And so this idea of power wanting to concentrate, it's like the pull of a magnet. It's like a law of gravity. It's like a pecking order. It's like Isaac Newton's laws of gravity. The lesser mass is attracted to the greater mass. I mean, power wants to concentrate. The movie, The Lord of the Rings, there's a scene where Gandalf tells Frodo, always remember, Frodo, the ring is trying to get back to its master. It wants to be found. Power wants to concentrate. And the movie goes on to where Gandalf tells Frodo offers him the ring. He says, don't tempt me, Frodo. I dare not take it, not even to keep it safe. Understand, Frodo, I would use this ring from a desire to do good, but through me it would wield a power too great and terrible to imagine. What's he talking about? So you get somebody in power and they have the good intentions to do something good, but over time they like their position and they end up turning bad. So the Bible story, I mentioned this already, but Joseph is a good, godly man, concentrates power into the hands of the Pharaoh of Egypt. And what did that Pharaoh do with the power? He fed the children of Israel, gave them the best land in Goshen, gave him jobs taking care of his cattle. But then there was a new king that didn't know Joseph, and he used all this concentrated power to oppress the children of Israel, make them slaves, and throw their sons in the Nile River. And that's the dilemma. We get our guy in, and he concentrates power, and we let him get away with it because he's on our side, but then it ends up getting passed on to the other side, and they use it oppressively. And, there's lots of examples. One is William Howard Taft was a Republican. After being 27th president, he gets to be the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He's the first one to hire a clerk. He's the one that had them move the Supreme Court out of the basement of the Capitol into its own building. And he's the first one to federalize the court system. In other words, prior to him, you'd have different districts around the country, and different circuit courts would make different decisions, and they didn't always jive. And everybody was fine with it. Sort of like In New England, they would have blue laws where everything's closed on Sunday, but other states, they didn't have blue laws, and you could do business on Sunday. It's like you would go to different parts of the country. Like some states have marijuana and others don't. And, back then, different courts made different decisions, and they were fine with it. But it was Taft that federalized it, so when the Supreme Court says it, boom, law of the land. Well, he's a Republican, and but then following him is FDR, and he puts on the court a whole lot of people with their political agenda, and they use all this concentrated power to push their agenda. And it all of a sudden goes from the court across the country, and then in recent times we've seen decisions where they'll make a decision, and it's the law of the land. It's like the founders didn't really intend it to be set up that way. But it was this, a Republican Taft that started this. So that's the dilemma. You see Joseph was good, concentrates power, but then there was a new favor that didn't know Joseph. So the good guys concentrate power so they can do good more efficiently, but then they end up giving the power to somebody that uses it oppressively. And clearly, you got Cain killing Abel, Nimrod, Tower of Babel, thousands of years of Pharaoh, Caesar, Kaiser. Clearly, there's a global goal in mind. At some point, it's going to max out on a global level. And in a sense, death is a blessing. So these dictators die off. I mean, here's, again, Genghis Khan kills 30 million people. If he hadn't died, he'd have been happy to keep killing. So the idea is the devil has to start from scratch to try to, and all the kingdoms of the world are ruled through fear. And I talked about this in the other session. But Jesus says, the kings of the Gentiles exercise lordship over them. But ye shall not be so. He that is greatest among you, let him be as he that doth serve. I am among you as he that serveth. So we're talking about, instead of top down, it's bottom up. So God's kingdom is a voluntary bottom up service kingdom, not a top down, forcible, theocracy, dominant type of thing. Now, in reading through ancient civilizations, I saw three things kept repeating themselves. One is people groups would transition from hunter-gatherers to agriculture. Even the Bible has Adam and Eve plucking the fruit off the tree, but then Cain was a tiller of the soil. And once people groups moved to agriculture, they needed to know when to plant the crops, which means they had to keep track of the seasons, which means they had to keep track of the stars. So all these ancient civilizations would begin to build big, immovable structures to observe the stars. Stonehenge, ziggurats, pyramids, Cahokia Mountains, and it all had to do with the stars. And then somebody got to climb up the building, look at the stars, see when the seasons are about to change, and come down with this secret knowledge from heaven as to when to plant the barley. And this person began to consider themselves an intermediary between the heavens above and these lowly creatures down below. And before you know it, it turned into the divine right of kings. And so we look at these ancient civilizations, and the Babylonian and Assyrians were king priests. And the Egyptian pharaohs claimed to be the son of the god Osiris, that these kings were these intermediaries. And the Roman emperors had the cult of the August Caesar. The word August means divine, and they demanded their image be worshipped. And Chinese emperors ruled by claiming they had a mandate from heaven. And the Incan emperors claimed to be delegates of the sun god. And the Muslim caliphs claimed to be successor of the messenger of Allah. And the Indian Rajas were a semi-divine caste of rulers, and the Japanese emperors were heavenly sovereigns. And then they Christianized it in Europe and called it the divine right of kings. God chose me to be the king, so I can pretty well do anything I want. And if you're rebelling against me, you're rebelling against God. And so this idea of creator-king people. Here's Louis XIV, the Sun King that used to own the land we're on. He said, I am the state. One time his administrators said, King, you can't do this. It's illegal. He says, it is legal because I wish it. Oh, okay, I get it. The laws are nothing more than the king's wishes, and he just happened to have a really powerful army to make you obey. Here's King James of England, right? Jamestown, he says, kings are God's lieutenants upon earth, sit upon God's throne. The king is the overlord of the whole land, master over every person, having power over the life and death of everyone. And you begin to see why the founders wanted to break away from the kings. And so here's the British Empire at its biggest extent. The British Empire was a global empire. The King of England was a globalist. He was a one-world government guy with him at the top. It took centuries, millennium, for America to have a chance to break away from a king. And here's James Wilson, a signer of the Declaration and Constitution. He said, after a period of 6,000 years since creation, the United States exhibit to the world the first instance of a nation assembling voluntarily and deciding that system of government under which they should live. So he uses the number 6,000 and said something unique happened here. Here's Daniel Webster, Secretary of State, said, miracles do not cluster. What has happened once in 6,000 years may not happen again. Hold on to the Constitution, for if the American Constitution should fail, there will be anarchy throughout the world. Why would there be anarchy throughout the world? Because for thousands of years, people have suffered under tyrants and czars and dictators, and they thought, gee, if only we could rule ourselves without a king. Wouldn't that be wonderful? And in America, we did it, and if we blow it, there's nothing left for humanity to look forward to this side of heaven, right? Now, most of these records that we're talking about are records of limiting the power of a king. So everybody hold up a fist in one hand and say concentrated power, concentrated power. Fingers apart with the other hand and say separated power, separated power. Now back to the fist, concentrated power, concentrated power. That's world history. For most of world history, power is in the hands of the kings, pharaoh, Caesar, Kaiser, Sultan, Tsar. Very rarely is power stretched into the hands of the people with democracies and republics, but in times of fear, they let go of the rubber band and it snaps back into the hands of a governor who promises to fix this mess, all right? So, limiting a king. We look at these records. The first is you limit a king by the king's own words. We saw that in the Bible, where the king's having a party and his wife Vashti won't come out, and he says, I'll never see her again. And later he feels bad, and he wants to see her. And his advisors say, King, you can't see her. You said you couldn't see her again, so now you can't. Of course, that's when they get Esther and all the, and then there's Darius. They tricked the king Darius to sign something, say nobody can pray to anybody but you for 30 days. He signs it. And then they say, hey, we found Daniel praying to somebody other than you, and you signed this. He has to get thrown in the lion's den. And the king spends all day trying to figure a way around it, and he can't. So he puts Daniel in the lion's den, seals the tomb, and says, may your God be with you. So the first way to limit a king is by the king's own words. Right? And it's sort of scriptural, right? Because we hold God's word up to him. God, you said it, right? And then kings were limited by past kings' words. We saw that where Jews go back, rebuilding the temple. The locals, after a while, stop them and send a letter to the king, say these people are going to rebel. The Jews send a letter to that king and say, no, dig in the records. You'll see. And so they dig in the records and they find Cyrus's order letting them go back. And so the current king honors the past king's words. And all the past king's words are called traditions and customs. Well, the kings have been doing this for years and years and years. And so this king does it because all the previous kings were doing it. But it's a limiting on the king. And then kings are limited by religion. So these pagan kings claim to be divinely appointed. They needed a pagan divine class of religious people to give them the rubber stamp of approval. And so, in Egypt, the priests would admit, or confirm that the Pharaoh was the delegate of, Osiris or whatever. And so when the Pharaoh was collecting land, he let the priests keep their own land. And but this was a limiting power because every now and then they would divinate. They'd look at like some chicken liver and they would say, oh, this king's no longer, there was one Chinese emperor, his palace was struck by lightning. And since the emperor ruled by claiming he had a mandate from heaven, this was like, oh, heaven doesn't like this guy, so everybody backs away from him. But then they Christianized it in Europe, and that was the Pope would put the crown on, the king's head. And the Pope would always have this little card that he could excommunicate the king if he didn't do what he wanted, right? And so there was a little bit of a power struggle there that was limiting the kings. And then you had kings limited by public opinion. So even the kings want to be liked. And then they're limited by princes and noblemen. So the kings raised taxes from the people. And they needed somebody to actually go out and collect the taxes. And they would have their barons and their lords and their dukes, and they would allow them to have some military and weapons to go out and collect their taxes. Well, what happened was there was a King John in England, and his brother was Richard the Lionheart that fought the Third Crusade, and Richard was captured. And anyway, long and short of it, King John was arbitrarily taking away land from his different dukes and barons and getting rid of one and putting another one in. And these dukes and barons, there's 25 of them, they're like, we don't like this. We're living so arbitrary. I mean, one day the king could wake up and decide to get rid of one of us. So they summoned King John to a meeting in the fields of Runnymede. And the king comes out of his castle, he comes over the hill, and it's not just these 25 barons, it's the barons with their armies. And they quickly close behind the king so he can't get back into the castle. And then they say, we want you to sign this document called the Magna Carta that says you can't arbitrarily take away our land and arbitrarily throw one of us in jail and replace us. And if you pick on one of us, the other 24 will team up against you. And King John was like, I knew I shouldn't have come out today. And so then these barons began to form something called the House of Parliament and then the House of Commons, and they would limit the king, so he had to get their approval and their funding before he could do stuff. And then America comes along, and we just flat out cut the umbilical cord. It's like, why spend all this effort to limit a king? Let's just flat out not have one. And so how did America come about? Just picking up with history, first 3 centuries of Christianity, there are 10 major persecutions. Christians are thrown to the lions. Constantine stops the persecution, and then the Roman Empire becomes Christian. Then you got Attila the Hun coming through in the 5th century, killing a bunch. But then you have Islam coming through in the 7th century. And Muhammad dies in 632 AD. And within just a century after his death, really 23 years after his death, the Muslim caliphs conquer all of Arabia. They conquer the Holy Land, which used to be Christian since Constantine. They conquer into Persia. They conquer into Syria. Syria was the first country that was completely Christian, evangelized by the Apostle Paul. The name Christian was first used in Syria until Caliph Umar conquered it around 648 AD. And then they conquered into Egypt. Egypt had been Christian for 6 centuries, evangelized by Mark that wrote the gospel, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, until Amir ibn Alas conquers it. And then all of North Africa used to be Christian. There were 250 Catholic dioceses along North Africa. St. Augustine of Hippo was from Carthage. Today that's Tunisia. And then they conquer into Spain. And they control Spain for 700 years. They cross the Pyrenees, they conquer southern France, and they're finally stopped outside of Paris at the Battle of Tours in 732 AD, just 100 years after the death of Muhammad in 632 AD. So they go from Arabia to Paris in a 100-year military campaign. And since this is the 1st century of Islam, there are some that look to this as their example. And these are the fundamentalist Sharia Muslims. Now, there's lots of Muslims that have sort of backslidden away from that. We call them moderate and peaceful, but in Islam, they have a concept. When your enemy shows weakness, that's Allah telling you to go back and start conquering again. And it's sort of the law of nature. Weakness invites aggression. And so they then have the Turks convert to Islam. And they conquer into what is today Turkey. Used to be the Byzantine Christian Empire. All 7 churches mentioned in the book of Revelation, Philadelphia and Thyatira and Sardis and Ephesus, were all conquered by the Turks. And then finally they conquer Constantinople, cutting off the land routes to India, and that's when Columbus set sail looking for a sea route. But finally in the 1500s you have Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent. He conquers Eastern Europe, and he's at the gates of Vienna. And the Catholic opponent is the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V of Spain. Holy Roman Emperor is a term where these kings would rule their own country. And then once every generation, they would pick one king who was really powerful, who would have double duty. And his job was to protect all of Christendom. And so that in the 1500s, this was Charles V of Spain. He controlled Spain, the Netherlands, Austria, and then all the New World, and then the blue areas through marriage, the Portugal and Brazil and those holdings. And so these are, in the 1500s, the 2 most powerful kings on planet Earth. We're talking kings, the most common form of government, and the 1500s you had Sultan Suleiman and Charles V. And then the Reformation starts. In the middle of all this, And Charles V, from his point of view, he has a double dilemma. He's got Protestant Reformation on one hand and Muslim invasion on the other hand. And so he tries to stop both and can't. And he realizes he needs the Protestants' help. So in 1555, he does the Peace of Augsburg. And you know the German pronunciation of 1555? 1555. I think that's funny. 1555. So in the Peace of Augsburg, there's a little Latin phrase that had enormous repercussions. And the phrase was cuius regio eius religio, which means whose is the reign, his is the religion. In other words, look, Protestant king, believe whatever you want in your kingdom. Let's just work together against this Islamic invasion because they sort of want to kill us all. And it worked. They teamed up. They stopped the Islamic invasion. But in the next century, different kings believed slightly different things. And so it was one Christian denomination per country in Europe, what the king believed the kingdom had to believe. And if you didn't believe the way your king did, you were persecuted and you fled. And so you had northern Germany and Sweden were Lutheran. And Switzerland was Calvinist, and Scotland was Presbyterian, and Holland was Dutch Reformed, and Greece was Greek Orthodox, and Spain, Portugal, Italy, France, so forth remained Catholic, and England, Anglican. But it was one denomination per country. And if you did not believe the way your king did, you were persecuted, you fled. And so suddenly, all of Europe went from being Catholic to being these different religions and denominations, and it caused wars and mass migrations of people shifting from one country to another simply for conscience sake. And those are the ones that spilled over and founded colonies in America. And so let's focus in on England, because this is where the Pilgrims came from. England had a king, Henry VIII, and he was Catholic, and he was married to Catherine of Aragon, the daughter of the King of Spain. And after 18 years, she does not have a son. Henry decides to divorce her. The Pope won't recognize the divorce because she is, after all, the daughter of the most powerful guy in the world. And so Henry decides that he's just going to make himself his own Pope. He starts the Church of England. He puts himself on as the head, and he goes on to have 6 wives. And their fates were divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. So Henry VIII was not a really nice guy to be married to. He ended up being around 400 pounds. He would only eat meat. He thought that vegetables were sissy food, right? He ended up getting gout in his leg, and none of the doctors wanted to tell him to get his leg chopped off. Back then, guys show off their biceps today. Well, back then, men showed off their calves. And they would wear these tight stockings, but they didn't invent an elastic yet, so they would tie them, and it would cut off the circulation. So they got this 400-pound guy tying off circulation. And anyway, none of the doctors would tell him. It's like, you tell him. I'm not going to tell him. Anyway, he dies. And but before he died, so he's divorcing his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, and he's marrying Anne Boleyn, who's a Protestant. And the advisors tell him, they said, Henry, if you're serious about breaking from Rome, you need to stop using that Latin Bible. Get yourself an English Bible. The German princes have Martin Luther's German Bible that helped them to break away from Rome. You need an English Bible. Henry says, great, get me one. Well, it just so happened a few years earlier, Henry had William Tyndale burnt at the stake for translating the Bible into English. But now he wants an English Bible. Matter of fact, William Tyndale's last words before he was burnt was, Lord, open the King of England's eyes. And so now the king suddenly wants an English Bible, so they take William Tyndale's work, polish it up, and they call it the Great Bible. And he orders a copy of it put in every church in England. Now, there were other scholarly translations, but this was the first one that was made accessible to the common people of England. And there's thousands of them, and they're chained to the pulpit because they're so valuable. So it's nicknamed the Chained Bible. And people would rent time to read it. It's like, your time's up, let me read it, and they'd the first time English-speaking people could read the Bible in their own English language. Henry dusts his hands and says, that's it, we have broken from Rome. But something unexpected happened. People began to read it. and began to compare what's in this Bible that they can finally read, and this king divorcing and beheading his wives and claiming to be the head of Christ's church on earth. And so a group starts that wants to purify the Church of England, and they're nicknamed the Puritans, right? Well, the king doesn't think he needs any purifying. He thinks he's fine just the way he is, and so he persecutes the Puritans. And there's another group that says it's beyond hope of purifying. We're just flat out going to separate ourselves. And they call themselves separatists, and we call them pilgrims. So these, and some of the separatists were Baptists, some of them were Congregationalists, eventually some of them were Quaker, but there's all these little splinter groups coming off, and the king's like, look, I broke from Rome. I didn't expect all these little groups to. And so the king says, yes, you can read the Bible in your own language, but no, you still can't believe whatever you want. You got to believe what I tell you to. I'm the king. And so they passed the Act of Uniformity of Common Prayer. In other words, you do not make up prayers because you could make up one that's wrong. So we've written all the prayers down, and we printed them in a book. And all you do is just open it to the page and read the prayer, right? And then they passed the 5 Mile Act. If you were caught preaching without approval of the government within 5 miles of a town, you have broken the 5 Mile Act, and they will drag you into the Star Chamber. It's sort of like, you know, the rooms where they want to do an investigation. They sort of pull you in. They were like, and it had stars on the ceiling, and they would twist your arm and brand you on the face as a heretic and cut off your ear and even cut your nose in half. And then they passed the Conventicle Act, and it comes from the word covenant, where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, I'm there in the midst, Jesus said. And so there were these small groups, mostly in Scotland, and they were meeting, and the king passed this act that says you cannot meet with more than 5 people in a group to talk religion without having cleared it with the government. You have to get government approval before you have church. And they later changed the name of the act to the Riot Act because they said, well, you know, you could be planning a riot. And so you would have your Bible study. The police would bust in, pull out a piece of paper, and read the Riot Act, which says everyone must immediately disperse or we will arrest you, put you in jail, and you'll die. It was so serious, it went into our vernacular. Read them the Riot Act. You know who was captured during this? John Bunyan. He was having a Bible study with too many people. They arrest him, drag him off. He says, better to be persecuted than be the persecutor. He spends 12 years in jail, and that's when he wrote Pilgrim's Progress. And one of the other separatists was a Baptist founder. Jefferson referred to him. His name was Thomas Helwise. And he dies in the Newgate prison in London. There was another prisoner named John Merton, one of the founders of the Baptist faith in England, and they wouldn't give him writing instruments. So 2 things. In the English prison, they do not feed you. You have to have some friend that misses you, and they bring you food. If they bring you some money, you can bribe the guard to put you in a cell where nobody's dying of smallpox. And they wouldn't give you anything to write with. Right? It wasn't like a little hotel room with some letterhead in the drawer and a pen, right? And so this John Merton, they put him in a cell, and he had a friend that brought him a bottle of milk. But instead of a cork, it had paper, a wad of paper. And the guard wasn't around. He unfolds the paper. He takes a splinter, dips it in the milk, and he writes out his pamphlets. And the milk dries. It's clear. He folds it up, puts it in the empty bottle, and his friend comes and takes it and takes it home and holds it over a candle just high enough so the heat of the candle turns the milk brown. And they can read what he wrote, and they typeset the pamphlets, and they print them. And they're like, how is he getting that out of the jail, you know? So Thomas Helwise was one of these dissenters, and he writes this pamphlet. He says, the king is a mortal man and not God. Therefore, he hath no power over the mortal soul of his subjects to make laws and ordinances for them and to set spiritual lords over them. If the king's people obey all humane laws made by the king, our Lord the king can require no more. For men's religion to God is betwixt God and themselves. The king may not answer for it, neither may the king be judged between God and man. Kings didn't like this. They wanted you to believe what they tell you to believe. They didn't want you to have this thing called, oh, conscience, and I feel this way. They don't care if you have a warm feeling in your heart. They want you to believe the way they tell you to believe. And so these separatists are persecuted. and these pilgrim separatists flee from England to Holland. One of the stories was that the separatists sold their property and made arrangements to get on a ship. But right before the ship left, the captain robbed them, turned them over to the police. They were put in jail. Another group of these separatists sell their property and arrange for a Dutch ship to sail up the coast. And the pilgrims show up a day early, and the waves are really bad, and the women and children, they decide to let them wait on the shore. Well, the Dutch ship comes, the men row out, they're storing everything on the ship, and somebody snitched, the British come over the hill, capture women and children. And the Dutch captain says, I can't fight, we don't have any army with me. He pulls anchor and sails away with the men. And you can just imagine these pilgrim women standing on shore, watching that boat getting smaller and smaller, and disappears over the horizon. For 2 years, they pass, those women and children, from one court and jail in England to another to another. Finally, a judge says, you really didn't do anything wrong, just go home. They go, duh, we sold our homes. So just to get them out of their hair, they put them on a boat, sent them over to Holland, and they were reunited with their husbands. And anyway, they're in Holland for 12 years. Spain threatens to attack Holland. It took 80 years for Holland to break away from Spain. And so the pilgrims leave Holland, and they are going to come to America. And they're waiting because the boat starts leaking, and they have to go back and fix it. Finally, they're sailing late in November, 66-day journey. They're in a 4-foot high space, and they're tossing and turning in the waves, 102 of them. One dies, a baby's born. And they finally get to America, and they find that they're 500 miles away from Jamestown. Jamestown was a king-run colony, and they were going to submit to the king, but feel like they're 3,000 miles away from the king so they can do their pilgrim stuff and not be noticed. But here, because of the storm, now they try sailing down the coast, but off the coast of Cape Cod, it's really shallow. If you've ever been to the beach and you can walk out, 100 yards and it only comes up to your waist, that's the way it was. You could be a half mile off the shore of Cape Cod and get stuck in the sand. And so the pilgrims get stuck, and it's a storm, and they almost sink. And the captain says, this is too dangerous. He goes back to Plymouth Rock and says, everyone off the boat. By the way, 3,000 ships have sunk off the coast of Cape Cod. It's called the graveyard of ships. And so the pilgrims say, well, wait a second, we have a question. Who's going to be in charge of us? There's no king-appointed person on our boat. The whole world's ruled by kings. We're underneath the King of England, and there's no king-appointed person in our group. Who's going to be in charge? We can't just be lawless. So they do something unique. They give themselves the authority to start a government. And it's called the Mayflower Compact. And it says, we, in the presence of God, covenant ourselves together into a civil body politic, to enact just and equal laws as shall be thought most meet or necessary, unto which we promise all due submission. Simple, revolutionary. It was a polarity change in the flow of power. Instead of top down, it's bottom up. In the womb of this little Mayflower is conceived this child of self-government, that we amongst ourselves can decide what laws we need to pass. And we just agree and we follow them without the king. It's a polarity change in the flow of power. It's the difference between a dead pyramid top down and a living tree bottom up, where every root and every tiny capillary root helps suck in nutrients to help keep the tree alive. It's the difference between divine right of kings and we the people. So where did the pilgrims get this idea that they could rule themselves without a king? Their pastor, John Robinson. He was not a king-appointed Anglican pastor. He was a Congregationalist pastor, which was the church model that was popular after the Reformation, where the pastor's job is to get everybody to be born again and have their own relationship with God, and then coach them to grow up in spiritual maturity, and then find their place in the body to plug in so that the whole body can be involved in ministry, rather than the hierarchical model where the pastor does all the ministry, the clergy, and the laity is lazy and watches. Right? The congregational model is everybody has a relationship with the Lord, and the pastor teaches them how God worked in the past. So if God's going to tell you to do anything in the future, it's got to line up with what he did in the past, because God's perfect. He doesn't change, and so you don't get off into crazy stuff. And this painting, by the way, hangs in our U.S. Capitol Rotunda. So this pilgrim congregational model of church government, the word church comes from the Greek word ecclesia. Ek means out of, ecclesia means a calling, and it's the Greek word for Athens, where they would have 6,000 citizens, and they would call them out of their home to the agora marketplace, and they would talk about what needed to take place in the city and who's going to do what. And so Jesus chose this word. Upon this rock I'll build my ecclesia, my body, right? Everybody's an eye, an ear, a foot. Everybody does something. And the king didn't like that. He didn't like the body ministry and everybody being involved. He liked the hierarchical model because he was at the top, right? It was him and the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Archbishop of York, and the deaneries and vicars and curates and all that. So the pilgrims come over 1620. And there's only a couple hundred of them. But the King of England, he not only doesn't like these Puritans or these pilgrim separatists, he doesn't like the Puritans because they're trying to purify him. And so in 1630, you have close to 20,000 Puritans sell everything and leave England. They estimate a fifth of the wealth of England left. It's called the Great Migration. Now, the ones that stayed over there, they ended up having a civil war, and they won. And for about 15 years, they had the Commonwealth of England, which was their attempt to have an America over in England. And it almost worked, but Oliver Cromwell died. His son wasn't very good at keeping things together, and they decided to bring Charles II, the son of Charles I, back, and they reinstate the monarchy. So they had a 15-year America experiment over in England, but they went back to a king. But we had a 3,000-mile ocean. Anyway, so these Puritans come to America. Now, the Puritans, in England, they didn't like the king telling them how to have church. But now in America, there's so many of them, 20,000. They sort of are the government. And so they have a little change of heart. They say, well, maybe it's not such a bad thing that the government tell the church how to have church because we are the government. And so the non-conforming congregational pastors said, no, you're still not supposed to have the government tell the church how to have church. And so they fled again. And you had John Lothrop and his church fled and founded Barnstable, Massachusetts. And Reverend Roger Williams and his church fled and founded Providence, Rhode Island. And Reverend John Wheelwright and his church fled and founded Exeter, New Hampshire. And Reverend Thomas Hooker and his church fled and founded Hartford, Connecticut. And this is 50 years before the Age of Enlightenment and John Locke's two treatises. Right, people, you read, the schools that say, oh, the founders got all their ideas from the Age of Enlightenment and John Locke. It's like, okay, this is 50 years before that. These are separatist, dissenting pastors and churches fleeing the Puritans. Anyway, so Thomas Hooker. Puritans said only Puritans could vote. Thomas Hooker said anybody that's a Christian should be allowed to vote. That was a big enough difference to where he said, okay, church, next Saturday, meet in the parking lot with your wagons and cows, and we're leaving. And they left. They went hill and dale, and they founded Hartford, Connecticut. And after they were there for a couple of years, the church members go to the pastor. And they say, Pastor, can you do a sermon on how we're supposed to set up our government? So he gives a sermon in 1638 titled, The Foundation of Authority is Laid, Firstly, in the Free Consent of the People. This is reflected in our Declaration of Independence, government from the consent of the governed. And this is different than the rest of the world, which the foundation of authority is divine right of kings. Right? The King of England, foundation of his authority, the Creator gives me all the power and I dispense it to the lowly people. It's all top down. And he's saying, no, the foundation of authority is the free consent of the people. It's bottom up. His sermon goes on, the privilege of election belongs to the people, according to the blessed will and law of God. This is reflected in our Constitution. We, the people. And then his sermon goes on. They who have the power to appoint officers and magistrates, it is in their power to set the bounds and limitations of the power. His sermon is written down. It's called The Fundamental Orders of Connecticut. And historian Thomas Fiske called it the first written constitution in history. It becomes a blueprint for the other New England colonies and eventually the U.S. Constitution. So he took his church model of government and made it their community model of government. Everybody's involved in the church. Everybody's involved in the community government. So Connecticut's called the Constitution State. Have it on their license plate. Here's a plaque in England. Thomas Hooker, founder of the state of Connecticut, father of American democracy. How do you like that? Some guy you never heard of, and they call him the father. Here's another plaque in England. Thomas Hooker, Puritan clergyman, reputed father of American democracy. Here's a statue of Thomas Hooker at the state capitol grounds in Hartford, Connecticut, holding a Bible. The base, it says, leading his people through the wilderness. On this side, he preached the sermon, which inspired the fundamental orders. It was the first written constitution that created government. Here is another plaque in Hartford. It says, Thomas Hooker preached his famous sermon, the foundation of authority is laid in the free consent of the people, and then the representatives of the people adopt his sermon as the fundamental orders of Connecticut. What do the fundamental orders say? The people can join ourselves to be as one public state or commonwealth. This sounds like the Mayflower Compact. We covenant ourselves together to form a civil body politic. Now, why? To preserve the liberty and purity of the gospel of our Lord Jesus. In other words, they picked the form of government that would best preserve the freedom of conscience to have Christianity as something that you could freely choose versus the government of England that forces its government beliefs on everybody. So instead of saying, okay, we got to get rid of our Christian faith because we got to preserve the First Amendment, separation of church and state. No. They said the gospel was the most important. They picked the form of government that would best preserve the gospel. Here's another plaque in Hartford. They have lots of plaques in Hartford. This one says, Thomas Hooker's congregation established the form of government upon which the present Constitution of the United States is modeled. Do you grasp the significance of this? Right? So his church model of government, everybody's involved, became the community model of government, everybody's involved. And so in New England, instead of separation of church and state, it was the pastors and their churches that created the state. How could you say, pastor, don't get involved in politics when it's his sermon that's their constitution? How could you say church members don't get involved in politics when all there was in Hartford was the church members? There wasn't anybody else for us to be lazy and let them take care of it. All there was the church members. The word politics comes from the Greek word polis, which means city. Metropolis, Indianapolis, Minneapolis, Annapolis. Polis means city, and politics is simply the business of the city, and all there was in the city of Hartford were the church members. And now, they had a building called a meeting house. Interestingly enough, in Israel, every community had a meeting house, and the Hebrew word for meeting house is synagogue. The word synagogue means meeting house. And so in New England, they would have a meeting house. That is where they would meet, and the pastor would teach the Bible, and that's where they would meet, and they would elect their city elders. I mean, why build an entirely separate building just to talk about a different subject? And so when the Revolutionary War starts, the British military governor sent over to Massachusetts, Thomas Gage, outlawed town hall meetings. He said, democracy is too prevalent in America. We don't need the citizens meeting and making resolutions and getting involved. You just do what the king's administrator tells you to do. It's all top down. And these Massachusetts, no, it's bottom up, right? So we begin to see this conflict. Calvin Coolidge said, the principles which went into the Declaration of Independence are found in the sermons of the early colonial clergy. They preached equality because they believed in the fatherhood of God, brotherhood of man. In order that they might have freedom to express these thoughts and opportunities to put them into action, whole congregations with their pastors migrated to the colonies. Now, in New England, the pastors were doing an experiment. They realized that the kingdom of God could never be forced from the top down. They could not be a theocracy, right? Why? Because they came from Europe, where kings were burning people at the stake for not believing the way the government tells them to believe. And they saw in the scriptures that Jesus himself never forced anybody to follow him. Right? He just multiplied loaves and fishes, had a crowd following him for a free lunch. And it's like he said something he knew would be difficult for them to understand, to shake away those following him for the wrong reasons who wanted to make him king, right? And when they left, it says, many disciples followed him no more. And they said, this is a difficult saying. Who can bear it? Jesus didn't run after him and say, wait a second, you misunderstood me. He didn't run after him with a sword and say, get back here or I'll chop your head off. No, he turns to Peter and says, you want to go too? There's the door. Peter said, where else can I go? You're the only one with the words of eternal life. In other words, Jesus was not only not forcing them to follow him, he was even wanted to shake away those that were following him for the wrong reasons, materialistic reasons. And so if Jesus never forced anybody to follow him, we can't force anybody to follow him. And so these founders in New England, these pastors, realized if the kingdom of God cannot be shoved and forced by a government from the top down, how's it ever going to happen? They thought that if the majority of the people held godly values and elected representatives with those values, then laws would be passed reflecting those values. And the values of the kingdom could percolate bottom up voluntarily instead of being shoved from the top down. And so this is the change that happened in New England. Instead of divine right of kings, creator king people, it's the creator gives rights and possessions and freedoms to every individual person. And we're all equal, and we choose from amongst equals who's going to fix the potholes in the road and who's going to take care of all these responsibilities. Right? So God's jealous. He doesn't want the government in between you and him. Calvin Coolidge, placing every man on a plane where he acknowledged no superiors, he must inevitably choose his own rulers through a system of self-government. Now, where did the New England pastors get the idea that the people could rule themselves without a king? Well, a little from the English Magna Carta and so forth, and a little from the Roman Republic, a little from the Athenian democracy, but ultimately, ancient Israel. And so they taught Hebrew at Yale and Harvard. And now this is interesting. I call this prima facie evidence, first-hand evidence. So the Constitution is written, but before it goes into effect, it needs to be ratified by 9 states. They have 8, and New Hampshire was in line to be the 9th. But New Hampshire was having a deadlock, and they're about to vote against it. And so Harvard President Samuel Langdon shows up at their ratifying convention in 1788, and he gives a sermon titled, "The Republic of the Israelites, an Example to the American States." Instead of the 12 tribes of Israel, we may substitute the 13 states of the American Union. See this application plainly. After his address, they vote. They ratify it. They're the 9th state to ratify it, and our U.S. Constitution goes into effect. Our U.S. Constitution literally went into effect after the sermon, "The Republic of the Israelites, an Example to the American States." What was the Republic of the Israelites? Well, around 1400 BC, millions of the Israelites come out of Egypt, and for 400 years they do not have a king. Right? And you don't appreciate it until you spend time researching every civilization on the planet, and especially every civilization at that time period, and it's all kings and maharajas and Chinese emperors and King Aga Bashan, everything's kings. And here you have a nation with millions of people and no king. And instead of you're friends with the king, you're more equal. You're not friends with the king, you're less equal. You're an enemy of the king, you're dead or you're a slave. In Israel, there was no king or royal family to butter up next to. And the law specifically said there is no respect of persons in judgment. Rich or poor, everyone's to be treated the same. Male, female, made in the image of the Creator. This is the beginning of the concept of equality on planet Earth. That everyone you see is equal to you. There's no royal family, right? Israel had tolerance. Here they were worshiping the one true God, and they never felt compelled to force anybody to worship the one true God. Get your lamb, drag it to the temple. No, they realized your worship is only pleasing to God if it's voluntarily given. Israel was the first nation with private land ownership. You see, wherever there's a king, you never really own the land. It's always conditional of you staying on the nice side of the king. You cross the king, he'll take away the land and kill you. But in Israel, every family was given land. If you own land, you can accumulate stuff. The Bible calls that being blessed, and you can be moved upon to give away some of your stuff. The Bible calls that charity. Israel, the children were taught the law. And God chose Abraham because he knew he would teach the children the law. So the battle is over who gets to teach the kids. Remember Plato, the philosopher king, right, wanted to take the kids away from the family and indoctrinate them with noble lies. And then, because the kids know the law and everybody in the country knows the law, everybody in the country is involved in police work. Everybody was deputized. They actually had no police in ancient Israel. Everyone was taught the law. Everyone helped enforce the law. We have a little of that today with traffic laws. Somebody cuts you off, you take it upon yourself to honk the horn. Or maybe a mom watching a bunch of neighborhood kids, she has no problem correcting somebody else's kid. In ancient Israel, everybody corrected everybody else. It was a self-policing system. And Israel had no standing army. You have a king, he has an army to enforce his will. In Israel, every man was in the militia and armed with a sword upon their thigh and ready at a moment's notice to defend his family and his community. Ancient Israel had no prisons. So in Egypt, Joseph was in prison for several years. In Israel, when a crime was committed, you immediately got the elders, the accused, you went to the city gates, and you had the trial right then. And of course, there was a city of refuge that you could run away to in a capital case. And then Israel had a bureaucracy-free welfare system. What's that? In Egypt, you need grain. The government comes along and says, we'll give you grain, but it's in exchange for your cattle, your land, your children, your lives. But in Israel, when you harvested your field, you left the gleanings for the poor people, the corners of the field, right? Like Ruth could, right, come and glean from the field. This way, the poor were taken care of without some political leader collecting everything and doling it back out in exchange for votes. Israel had a system of honesty. God hates unjust weights and measures, so you could trust people and became the basis for commerce. And Israel got to choose their own leaders of their different tribes. And so Moses spake unto the children of Israel, how can I myself alone bear your burden? Take you wise men and understanding and known among your tribes, and I'll make them rulers over you. This was an election process within the tribe. You know the people that hate covetousness and you just can't bribe them no matter what, right? So you pick them and you push them to the front and say, Moses, this is our guy. So anyone in Israel could be raised up into leadership. Here's Gideon from a nobody family. Here's Deborah, a woman, becomes a national leader, not because she's related to royalty. She just knows the law. She's honest. The reputation spreads. She sits under a tree. People make their way all the way across the country to have her hear their case and tell them what the law says. Where else in the world, especially at this time, could a woman become a national leader? It's not related to royalty. Anyone could be raised up. So Harvard President Samuel Langdon finishes his address. He says, the Israelites may be considered as a pattern to the world in all ages of government on republican principles, from abject slavery, a mere mob, to a well-regulated nation under laws far superior to what any other nation could boast. Think of it. They go from 400 years of slavery. They can't even read. And suddenly they get downloaded the most unique form of government, so contrary to human nature, so contrary to all these kings. And so they had no king for 400 years. And it wasn't like Athens. You read the Greek history, and it's all trial and error, right? Each Sparta, every city has their own little combination of noblemen and elders and all this kind of stuff. Israel wasn't trial and error. It was one package system that was downloaded. And then ancient Israel was the first nation that could read. I thought this was really interesting. So in Sumeria, they had 1,500 cuneiform characters. Writing started as an accounting method for kings to keep track of everything they owned, right? So in China, they had knots and ropes. And then there was an abacus with rods and beads. And then it turned into tokens and dishes. And they'd have a barn, how much grain is in there? Well, we got this little dish with these little tokens. They would make markings on the tokens, like the lines 1, 2, 3, 4, and a line across for 5. So writing started as an accounting method for kings to keep track of everything their own. Then there are king's decrees, and then the king's genealogies, and then some astronomy type stuff. The common people didn't own anything. They didn't have any royal heritage. So the common people didn't read. Only the kings could read, and the scribes. Egypt had 3,000 hieroglyphic characters. I don't know about you, but memorizing 3,000 anythings is not fun. Only 1% of Egypt could read. Reading and writing was the scribe's secret knowledge. And they actually kept the hieroglyphs complicated on purpose as job security. So they were needed as a class to interpret them. China had 10,000 characters, only for court records, when only the upper class could read. It was the communication of the deep state. Everybody else was kept in the dark. Uneducated people are easier to control. And we had a little of that in America prior to the Civil War, where Frederick Douglass, the Republican advisor to Lincoln, grew up on a plantation, and his slave master's sister-in-law was teaching him the alphabet. And her husband walks in, yells at her, says, "Don't you dare teach slaves to read. They'll grow discontent. They'll be able to run away." Frederick Douglass says, "That was the first sermon that convinced me that I wanted to learn how to read." And so here's anthropologist Claude Levi-Strauss said, ancient writing's main function was to facilitate the enslavement of other human beings. And so when Moses comes down the mountain, he does not just have the law, he has the law in a 22-character alphabet. First letter's Aleph, second letter Beth. Sound familiar? It's so easy to learn, kids could learn it. So not only did the priests teach the law, they taught everyone how to read the law for themselves so they could maintain their liberty and maintain their freedoms. Ancient Israel was the first literate population on planet Earth. The people of the book. And then they had the Ten Commandments, right? And here's Eupolemus, a Greek philosopher, 158 BC. Moses was the first wise man that taught the alphabet to the Jews, who passed it to the Phoenicians, who passed it to the Greeks. Harry S. Truman said the fundamental basis of this nation's laws was given to Moses on the Mount. And then we already read Margaret Thatcher's quote, and we went through this. So you got power concentrated in the hands of a king. He rules through fear. And if you're going to have power in the hands of the people, it's chaos unless everybody's taught the law. An example is like an app, and then it's the Levites that help teach it to you. And God's watching. Everyone wants you to be fair, going to hold you accountable. Everybody has a conscience. And God knew that they would sin, so once a year their sins were forgiven because after the Day of Atonement. And here's a Democrat candidate for president, William Jennings Bryan. A religion which teaches personal responsibility to God, gives strength to morality. There is a powerful restraining influence in the belief that an all-seeing eye scrutinizes every thought and word and act of the individual. And what if people have lost the fear of God? So get rid of this God. All you got is a bunch of laws that some old men made up, and then why follow them? Some will, some won't. Those that won't are going to give into their selfish side. It's going to turn into lawlessness. We talked about that with Plato, that democracy is doomed to fail. And then we talked about the high priest not teaching the law to his own sons, and then the Levite having a graven image, not following the law, and then a Levite with a concubine, and every man does what's right in their own eyes. It turns into this chaos, and they finally have a king. It's sort of like a teeter-totter. The less external restraints have to be balanced out with more internal restraints. This is where, I take issue with libertarians. They're like, less federal stuff. I say, yeah, go for it. But unless you replace it with more internal morals, you're just going to have chaos. And then out of the chaos and random killings, people are going to say, we want somebody to come along and fix it. And you'll end up with a king. And it's like a teenager. You give them the car keys. You said, you're a good kid. You got internal morals. You know when to come home. So just, whenever you want to come home, come home. I know you're going to do what's right. But if you don't follow those internal morals and you yield to your friends and your passions and your lust, you're going to get caught driving and speeding and drinking, and you're going to be put in jail. So, teenager, you are going to be controlled, either voluntarily from the inside or forcibly from the outside. It is the same way with a nation. We are either going to be voluntarily controlled with internal morals that you follow because you're accountable to a God that watches everyone, wants you to be fair, going to hold you accountable, or you get rid of this God. You teach the kids there's no right, there's no wrong. You don't even know if you're a boy or a girl anymore. There's no borders, there's no guidelines. You can feel different every day. And we push the kids out on the street and they say, I feel like killing you. I feel like beating you. I feel like taking your stuff. And it turns into chaos, lawlessness. And that's when a dictator can seize power. So we go back to world history and these 6,000 years, and we see these kings and pharaohs and Caesars and Kaisers and sultans and czars, all concentrated power. And as the centuries go on, with military advancements, they can kill more people. With technological advancements, they can track more people. Clearly, there's a global goal in mind. The King of England was the biggest. America's founders break away, flipped it, make the people the king. And we take the power of the king, separate it into 3 branches, separate it federal to state level, tie up with 10 handcuffs. We call the first 10 amendments. All our Constitution is a bunch of hurdles to prevent a president from ruling through mandates and executive orders. That's all our Constitution is to prevent one person from rulings through mandates. Take the power of the king, separate it. 3 branches, separate it federal to state level. Tie it up with 10 handcuffs, the 10 amendments. I used a way of explaining the Constitution I'm one of 11 kids, so I have 5 brothers, 5 sisters. And I remember coming in one time from playing, and my mom had cooked brownies, but the other kids ate. All there was 1 brownie left. My little brother and I were about to fight over it. And my mom says, okay, one of you cuts it, and the other gets to pick the first piece. Works great unless you did it with my little brother, because he spit on me and got both pieces. Of course, I punched him. But imagine a big brownie, 3 hungry boys. You give them each a job. The first one's job is to trace out on the brownie where it's going to be cut. He doesn't know what piece he's going to end up with, so he's going to trace those pieces exactly what? Equal. Second one's job is to take the knife and actually execute it, sign it into law, enact it. And the third one's job is a judge until you get to its piece. So you have the legislative branch laying out, tracing out the laws, the executive branch signing it and enacting it into law, and the judicial branch judging the law. It's a stroke of genius. Their greedy, hungry tummies cause them to be honest. This would be like Pastor John giving you an assignment. Go home and design a system of government where sinners keep other sinners from sinning. That's what our Constitution is. Greedy, selfish men keeping other greedy, selfish men from becoming greedy and selfish. The founders knew there are no angels on earth to govern us, and all we're left with is selfish human beings. Right? We get born again, we try to do what's right, but you still are tempted to want to prefer your family and friends, right? So the idea is that you have to use selfish nature to check selfish nature. Right? If there were, if there are no angels on earth, there are no perfect people that are immune to temptation. And so we have to have a committee to watch these people to make sure they don't do anything wrong. Well, this committee is made up of humans that can be bribed. Okay, we need another committee to watch this committee. Well, this is made up of men that can be bribed. Okay, we need another committee. It's never ending. So our founder said, let's just break it into 3. And by the way, George Washington warned in his farewell address that the only thing that can short circuit this breaking power into 3 branches is parties. Not drinking parties, but political parties. And so you had the beginnings of the Federalists wanting a strong central government and the Anti-Federalists wanting a weak central government. One wanted to have a strong central government so you could have a navy and a stable currency so you could trade with Europe, and the other wanted a weak central government so we wouldn't have the Frankenstein like King George. And so we began to see Jefferson leading the more or less anti-federalist side, and John Alexander Hamilton leading the more concentrated side, and George Washington seeing these formations of these parties. And he goes, this is dangerous, because if you got 3 branches, if 2 of the branches of government said, why should we be, it's like a 3-way tug of war. It's like, why should we be pulling against each other? Let's team up and pull together against that side. And then all of a sudden, it loses its dynamic tension, and the whole thing collapses. And so, anyway, so in America, who is the king? Who is the king in America? It's the title of my book. Signer of the Constitution, Gouverneur Morris, said the magistrate is not the king, the people are the king. Chief Justice John Jay, the people are the sovereign of this country. Signer of the Constitution, James Wilson, sovereignty resides in the people. They have not parted with it. Abraham Lincoln, the people of these United States are the rightful masters of both Congresses and courts. Grover Cleveland, the sovereignty of 60 millions of free people is the working out of the divine right of man to govern himself, a manifestation of God's plan concerning the human race. So who's the king in America? We are. The word citizen is Greek. It means co-ruler, co-king. Right? So kings have subjects who are subjected to the king's will. Republics and democracies have citizens, and the word citizen means co-king. Right? You're a citizen, you're a co-king of America. James Wilson, every citizen forms a part of the sovereign power. He possesses a vote. Now, what about Romans 13? Every person must be subject to the governing authorities. Well, who's the ultimate governing authority in America? It's the people. The politicians are the servants. It's sort of silly for a king to have to obey us. Imagine a king going through his castle, and the janitor says, sorry, king, you can't go in this part of the castle anymore. It's like, who are you? Oh, I'm the janitor. Where'd you come from? The cook and the butler. They hired me. I'm like, the cook and the butler, they're my servants. So you're like a servant of a servant. It's like, yeah, who's a Supreme Court justice? Well, they're appointed by the president. I vote in the president. Well, they're confirmed by the Senate. Well, I vote in the Senate. So a Supreme Court justice is like a servant of the servant. Yet they're saying, okay, from now on, marriage is this. From now on, you can abort your kids. From now on, it's like, who are you to tell us? Right? We're the king. The king doesn't obey the servant obeys the king. And so a republic is where the people are king. We pledge allegiance to the flag and to the republic. So we're basically pledging allegiance to us being in charge of ourselves. Right? And when somebody protests the flag, what they're saying is, I don't want to be the king anymore. I protest this system where I participate in ruling myself. It's like, okay, somebody else will be glad to rule your life. Now, imagine visiting a king. Maybe in the Old Testament, you're going through the streets of Jerusalem and you're witnessing murder, rape, and crime, and you get into the king's chamber. He's got his head in his hand. He's all worried, and he looks up at you, and he says, did you see all that crime coming in here? I wish someone would fix it. And you reach over, tap him on the shoulder, say, excuse me, you're the king? This is your kingdom? I think you're the one accountable to God to fix this mess? That's like somebody in America watching TV, seeing all the terrible stuff going on, saying, I wish somebody would fix this mess. Hello, have a finger reach through the screen and tap you on the shoulder. You're the king. You're the one accountable to God to fix this mess. Well, I need somebody to tell me what to do. Since when does the king sit on his throne and say, can somebody tell me what I'm supposed to do here? Hey, butler, janitor, come here. What am I supposed to do? No, it's your job to get educated on the issues, seek God's will, and you tell your representatives what needs to happen. You're the king. Chief Justice John Jay, Americans are the first people whom heaven has favored with an opportunity of choosing the forms of government under which they should live. Every other constitution have derived their existence from violence or accidental circumstances. Your lives, your liberty, your property will be at the disposal only of your Creator and yourselves. If I were to pick one quote that shows the greatness of America, it is this quote right here. Your lives, your liberty, your property are at the disposal of you and God. You and God get to decide where you want to live, what career you want to pursue, what church you want to go to, right? Who you want to marry. You get to make all these decisions for your life. You're, in a sense, the king of your life. And then all of us together are king of the country. Ronald Reagan said, in this country of ours took place the greatest revolution that has ever taken place in the world's history. Every other revolution simply exchanged one set of rulers for another. You get rid of a good king, or, then you get a bad king. Then you get rid of the bad king, and but it's all kings. It's all concentrated. He says, here, for the first time in all the thousands of years of man's relation to man, how many thousand? Maybe 6,000? The founding fathers established the idea that you and I had within ourselves, the God-given right and ability to determine our own destiny. Right? You get to be in charge of your life. And so, poet Ralph Waldo Emerson, America appears like a last effort of divine providence in behalf of the human race. And this scripture motivates me. A good man leaves an inheritance to his children's children. So it's like, okay, if you and I are good people, we want to leave a country to our kids as good as what we inherited. And so in America, you're the king of your life, and then you have the opportunity of willingly submitting yourself to Jesus, the King of Kings. You're not forced to, but you have the opportunity to. It says, thy people shall be willing in the day of thy power. And Jesus has made us kings and priests, with the K with a little, king with a little K. And so we're all little kings, and we get the opportunity to throw our crowns at his feet. And he's the King of Kings. But it's voluntary. Now this is interesting. If the people are the king, who are the counselors to the king? So 379 AD, the Roman Empire has a Christian emperor named Theodosius. He's going to church in Milan, Italy. And there's a pastor named St. Ambrose, Bishop Ambrose. What would it be like being Bishop Ambrose and having the emperor in your church on Sunday? Guess what? That's exactly what we have in America. Right? In America, the people are the king, and the people go to church. Now, we've gone down. In 1965, 69% of America was Protestant, 24% Catholic, 3% Jewish, but 96% believed basic Bible beliefs that we're made in the image of God, and this God is not a respecter of persons. But over the years, it's gone down and down and down. Right now, Pew Religious Landscape Survey said only 65% of the people identify as Christians. But 65% is still a majority. And so if the majority of the people identify as Christians, they go to church and they listen to their pastors. And the pastors are like counselors to the king, right? Instead of Bishop Ambrose with the emperor in his church, in America, the people are the king and the 65% are Christian and they're listening to their pastors. So the pastors are counselors to the king. So the movie The Lord of the Rings has this scene where there's this King Theoden, and he has a spell cast on him, and he's out of it. I mean, he's got cataracts on his eyes. He's got gray hair. He's like, and he has a counselor named Worm Tongue. And this guy's whispering in his ear saying, stay asleep, don't wake up, don't get involved. Yeah, your kingdom's being overrun, but just wait a little bit longer and it's all going to be over. Then there's another counselor to the king named Gandalf. And he casts the devil out of the king. And right before your eyes, the king starts to wake up and he starts to come to, and he looks around the room and he says, dark have been my dreams of late. It's like, yeah, you've been out of it with this spell cast on you. And he says, maybe you'll remember your strength if you take your sword, right? And so you have, the pastor's job is to wake up the king. So you have some pastors telling the king, don't get involved, just concentrate on your own relationship with God and forget leaving to your kids and grandkids a country with the same freedoms that you had, right? A good man leaves an inheritance. Forget all that. Just concentrate on yourself and. But then there's another set of pastors that throw ice water on their congregation. Says, wake up. You don't just have the right to vote in America. You're going to be held accountable to God for what happens. Right? So the king's in the pews. Right? And that's why I love your pastor so much, that he has the wisdom and the courage to tell you, right? You're the people. You're in charge. Get out there and do something with your life. Get involved. Have God's will work through you in this world. Love the unlovable, right? Reach out to the hurting. Defend the defenseless. Here's a quote from John Jay. It is the right and duty of our pastors to press the observance of all moral and religious duties. So the most important thing is to bring people to Christ. But the second most important thing is to preserve the freedom to do the most important thing. Right? So if you're in Pakistan, where it's an Islamic Sharia state, it is the death penalty for you to tell someone about Jesus and for them to convert. In Hindu India, some of the radical areas, if the Dalits convert to Christianity, they end up having people want to kill them because they're escaping from the caste system. If you're in North Korea or Hong Kong, right, when the communist government comes in and arrests you and takes you away, you don't have the freedom. And Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., the church is the conscience of the state. So the church is supposed to address every issue that's out there. And then I end with this. In times of crisis, people turn to Christ. And in times of crisis, leaders are raised up. And so what are the stories we love best in the Bible? There's a crisis, and God raises up some little nobody with faith and courage to do big things and turn things around. And anyway, let's see, I think I just went through these slides. And I wanted to end with this one thought, that someday you're going to be dead. That's a nice way to end a talk, isn't it? And but you're going to be in heaven because you believe that Jesus died on the cross to pay for all your sins. And when we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun, with no less days to sing his praise than when we just begun. Imagine you've been in heaven 10,000 years. You're walking the streets of gold. Pretty cool. You're meeting Moses. Maybe Moses will invite you over to his place. I don't know what it's like in heaven, but Jesus said, in my Father's house there are many mansions. And I bet Moses will have a pretty nice place. He'll probably have one of those fireplaces with the logs that don't burn up. Get it? The burning bush in the wilderness didn't burn up, and the logs in his fireplace didn't. I heard one preacher say, in heaven, you'll travel as fast as you think, and I'll probably show up late. My wife will say, where were you? I was thinking about something else. But imagine being there. Maybe Moses has a big living room like this. And after all the small talk's over, he's sitting at your table. And you say, Moses, tell us the story again. I read the book. I even saw the movie. But here you are in person. The room will get quiet. Moses will stand up and he says, I was 80 years old. And Pharaoh, the most powerful military leader in the world, was charging in at us. We were totally unarmed. And I just held out my staff and I said, God, use me to make a difference. And the waves came in and swallowed up Pharaoh's chariots. We're going to say, wow. Probably be like a 3D hologram. You can see it up there, right? And then we're going to look around the table and there's David at your table. And you say, David, tell us your story. The room will get quiet. David will stand up and goes, I was just a teenager, and this giant thug, Goliath, was mocking our God, making fun of our faith, and these grown-ups were too chicken to do anything. And I said, well, enough of that. Took my little sling, hit him in the head, and took his own sword and chopped his head off. We're going to say, wow. And then we're going to hear Gideon's story and Deborah and the Apostle Paul. It's going to be really exciting. And then they're going to go around the table, and they're going to look at you. See, we haven't heard from you yet. Tell us your story. What was going on down on earth when it was your turn to be down there? Tell us all the great courage and faith that you had against all kinds of great opposition. Tell us how the whole world was against you, and they were making fun of you and posting stuff online saying bad things about you. And tell us how you stood up. What did you do when you were backstabbed by all your Christian friends and you're about to give up on all of it, and you just kept your eyes on Jesus? And you just kept, all you had was a little thread of faith, but you just kept trusting him, and then it turned into a string and a rope and a cable, and finally the blessings and presence of God came back into your life. You know, I hate for any of us to be there and for Jesus to walk in and to have a big screen come down and show all kinds of great things happen and miracles and people coming to the Lord and him saying, this is what I had planned for you to do, but you just didn't have enough faith and courage. And you look back at your life, and that mountain that held you back, it was just a little bitty anthill. And you're like, I let that anthill, that fear of man, hold me back from doing all this great stuff. And you can't go back to earth and do anything else for Jesus because you're already in heaven because you believe that Jesus died on the cross to pay for all your sins. But guess what? We're still on this earth. We still have breath in our lungs. We still have feet that trod this. You still can do those things that you will be known for forever. Right? It's like a basketball game. And you're on the bench, and Jesus is the coach, and he comes over and slaps you on the back and says, okay, your turn, get in the game. And you're like, but coach, they're playing really tough out there. Yeah, I know. It's your turn, get in the game. But coach, somebody just got knocked down. Yeah, you're 7 feet tall, they're 4 feet tall. You can do this. Greater is he that's in you than he that's in the world. No weapon formed against you shall prosper. Though 1,000 fall at your side, 10,000 at your right hand, it'll not come nigh thee. He's given you his word. He's given you his spirit. He's given you great pastors like Pastor John. He's given it to you. He's got more faith in you than you do. He knew all the thousands of years of history, and he decided for you to be alive right now. He knows every dirty backroom deal. He knows all that. And he says, you've got enough to do it. This is your chance. This is your opportunity to shine. Be bold. Be courageous. Step out and let the Lord use you. Anyway, God bless you.